So now we're going to continue with the aspects videos here and talk about the planetary aspects. So planetary aspects are ones that are more familiar, and they're based on where the planets are moving in the sky and then the Drishti that the planets give. And there are several different kinds of aspects. We have the mutual aspects. Every planet casts a seventh house aspect from itself, meaning any planet that's in Aries is going to be aspecting Libra. Whether it's Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, or Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, all of them. Okay, not the nodes, but all the planets cast a seventh house aspect. And those are shared aspects, like when one planet is in the seventh house from another, they're sharing the aspect. They're mutually aspecting. But then the outer planets, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, also have special aspects. Mars aspects 4 houses in front and 8 houses in front. Saturn aspects, or actually I'll just say Jupiter aspects the 5th house in front and the 9th house in front. And Saturn aspects the 3rd house in front and the 10th house in front. So these are special aspects that come from the outer planets, then they're also very important. One of the reasons they're so important, and I just have to say, I don't hear any astrologers ever talk about it, and I've had to just sort of make up the term, is because they're one-way aspects. It's a one-way aspect, like when Mars is aspecting 4 houses in front, like a planet there's no return aspect. It's not a mutual aspect. Mars is here and he's aspecting 4 houses in front. That's a one-way aspect from Mars onto the other planet, meaning the other planet is not returning it like a 7th house aspect. So only the outer planets can give those aspects, and only they can give the one-way aspect. And so they're also very important when you see those in the chart as well. So we can make it also quite literal. We can also use the chart of Donald Trump. We looked at his chart for the Rashi aspects, and we saw that Rahu Sun aspecting Saturn Venus as a kind of fixed part of his nature, which includes his his love of beauty and glamour and wealth and luxury, which is shown by Venus Saturn. It's a kind of fixed thing aspecting his identity and his persona, which is the Sun, and Rahu also that love of responsibility and handling pressure, Sun Saturn. Also, Rahu Venus also shows in the, glamorous wives. Also, he owned the beauty pageant, the Miss America pageant for a long time. So you see that these are Rashi aspects. These are things that don't change, just like the Rashis don't change. They're fixed. In the midst of everything that goes on in his life, this is just the way he is. Just like his rambling sort of communication style with Jupiter and Mercury. Rashi aspecting each other. Jupiter's also retrograde in his 2nd house, so at times there's a sort of conflated, big, eccentric speech, but he really benefits from it because Mercury is in Gemini, so he really knows how to use his speech to his benefit, but it's that kind of rambling, at times imprecise speech, but he's still very skilled with it. So this is the Mercury-Jupiter Rashi aspect. Regardless of anything else that goes on in his life, this is a constant part of his nature. That's how you read the Rashi aspects. So planetary aspects are things that are more dynamic, which means they're things that change, they're things that are sort of processes that the person is working through. They're kind of working out. They're not as fixed. They're not just etched in stone. So you can see that he has a couple regular planetary aspects. Sun and Moon aspect each other. So, the Moon is the 12th house ruler because it rules, Cancer, which is the 12th house from Leo. And, of course, the Sun is the 1st house ruler. Moon is also debilitated there. So, the 12th house is the house of loss. And, he's had some big losses. He's, been through bankruptcies. And I know there's the rhetoric that he's formed hundreds of companies and only filed bankruptcy 4 times. It's a little bit not really a very reliable way to put it. That is maybe technically true, but you could say that you start a company because you start a line, like a line of shirts. So that's a new company. Truth is that some of his bankruptcies really were quite severe, and his creditors had to finance his bailout. Otherwise, they would have lost all their money. They were pretty severe regroupings, and of course, it's true. I mean, they were totally legal. There's nothing wrong with it, but there was some big losses and big risk that was happening, and you can see this 12th house of loss is a big part of his fortune. He's had some big ups and downs in his business and in his life, and these are things that, again, they're not constant. They're not as constant as like the pretty wives, the lot of duty and responsibility, the kind of rambling but skilled communication style. There are big ups and downs that come from his personal identity and his personal brand, and this sort of loss and the back and forth. You also see that same kind of thing sort of affirmed by the Jupiter one-way aspect. Now there's a Jupiter one-way aspect onto his Sun in the 10th house. Again, big gains and losses in his career. He's had some things that really didn't work out very well and things that have worked out really well. Truth is, the best things that have really worked for him consistently are just cashing in on the Trump name, the branding. He's an expert brander. His brand of, like his TV show is a brand. The Trump hotels, he just puts Trump on things. Trump steaks, Trump shirts, Trump. He'd like branding, putting his identity on things has actually been the best business model that he has, because some of his real estate endeavors, they're kind of up and down. They're kind of, sometimes he takes a risk and it doesn't work out, like with the casinos in Atlantic City or other kind of things like that. But what's been a consistent winner is his brand, which actually even has to do with his identity. So, but you see with this Jupiter planetary aspect, it shows again this up and down level of wealth. Jupiter is also retrograde, where sometimes the decisions you have to go back and do it again, which is what you would call a bankruptcy, or something where you have to go back and work through that dynamic. It's not just a fixed part of the person. It's a process that they're working on, a process that they're going through. And you can, in fact, see this effect of the 12th Lord on the Sun, back and forth, right? And you also have the nodes there. So they're big, excessive gains, excessive losses. There's also, Jupiter, which rules the 8th house, and it's retrograde in the 2nd and aspecting his first Lord in the 10th. So again, First Lord in the 10th, he's very much about his career and his reputation. And you can see how that sort of branding has been successful for him. And, really Jupiter giving this sort of gains and losses and this kind of, overall, obviously there's a lot of expansion because he's obviously been successful. And Jupiter is giving this one-way aspect to his Lagna Lord in the 10th, which gives enormous notoriety, recognition, confidence in the public, and also sort of confers this status of like a sort of inspiring person. At least inspiring to some people. He's certainly not inspiring to many, or I'm sorry, he's not inspiring to everyone, but he's certainly inspiring to some people. But again, it's a back and forth process. Sometimes he says things that are just kind of silly, and he's really sort of petulant and immature in some ways. It's kind of hard to say otherwise, getting into Twitter wars with Rosie O'Donnell and some things that are just really unbecoming of many people. It's not very dignified. And again, Leo is a sign of dignity. It's being dignified. Whether you agree, whether you like him or not, it's kind of hard to imagine that you couldn't at least see some of this. Even his supporters say, sometimes he goes a little too far, and that's kind of what we're talking about. So you can see this with this Jupiter retrograde. It gives him that certain status, but it's also something, it's not just a fixed part of the person. It goes back and forth. Sometimes he looks really powerful and strong. Other times he looks silly and petulant and immature and childish. So again, you see the difference between that and those fixed qualities that come from the Rashi aspects in these planetary aspects of Jupiter, of retrograde Jupiter on his 10th house, making him an inspiring figure, conferring grace to his public life. But sometimes it's grace, sometimes he looks foolish, sometimes he looks kind of embarrassing. He's got a certain amount of support, like in a political race, but a lot of people also really don't like him. And they say they'd never vote for him, for example. So it's a very kind of polarizing back and forth sort of thing. It's not just a fixed part of his character, which is this stellar reputation, for example. It's because of the influence of the moon, the 12th Lord, which changes it back and forth. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. And also Jupiter. Sometimes and to some people he's a very powerfully inspiring figure, which is definitely Jupiter. But to others, he's a very, very divisive and sort of clownish. And again, whether you agree with me or you have people all around the world that say this is just something that you have to see as fact. This is just how he comes across to some people. It's absolutely not a fixed part of his nature, which was shown in those Rashi aspects, things that are consistent parts of who he is. Always taking duty and responsibility, always committing to his reputation and his strength, surrounded by beauty, even in the things he purchases, luxury hotels, casinos, luxurious resorts, beautiful women, the Miss America pageant, all kinds of stuff. These are just fixed part of who he is, those Rashi aspects, and these planetary aspects are things that are kind of changing and back and forth and sort of dynamic. So that's what the planetary aspects are. They show these dynamic traits that we're sort of working through, and in different dasha cycles, you see this dynamic happening. The other the other planetary aspect that's quite notable is Mars aspecting his moon in Scorpio. So Mars in Leo is that fourth house aspect onto his moon in Leo, and so that that aspect. His moon is Scorpio. Mars in Leo, moon in Scorpio. And so this also gives a kind of back and forth sort of aggravated mentality, aggravated mind. Mars, Rashi aspecting the moon, obviously you would see it, and it's a one-way aspect, it's not mutual. The moon isn't returning the aspect, meaning Mars isn't benefiting from the comfort and the love and devotion of the moon. It's a one-way aspect where Mars is just putting that onto the moon. So at times, this is why at times he's very cranky, irritable, very emotionally aggressive and restless. Of course, the moon is also in Scorpio with Ketu, but besides that, other times he's quite gentle, and you can see he's a good family man and all kinds of things that's also shown by that moon in the fourth house. Does have a lot of power in other ways for sure, but this one-way aspect from the moon, from Mars onto the moon, is also easily shown. And again, it's something that's sort of back and forth. Although his moon is quite stressed, it is debilitated. It's with Ketu, and it's getting a one-way aspect from Mars. So that's a lot of malefic influence on the moon. And his Saturn is also putting a one-way aspect onto Jupiter, because Saturn in Cancer is putting a one-way aspect onto that Jupiter in a Virgo. So again, this means that especially when there's things that maybe evoke fear, or something that needs to be controlled, or some kind of dark, kind of sinister quality, it really brings out that sort of Jupiter in him. So Saturn is putting the one-way aspect onto Jupiter, which can definitely, again, make for this sort of, I'm determined to get my point across as well. I'm going to say the thing, and I'm going to keep saying it. I'm not going to back off on it. I'm not going to apologize. I'm not going to do anything. Saturn is like, and it has that influence on speech because Jupiter's in the second house and it's retrograde. So you see this, also this, that aspect of Saturn onto Jupiter definitely gives that sort of focus to his speech and that kind of stress. But again, it's as much a process as anything. It is there, but you see that he, sometimes that sometimes that aspect of Saturn onto Jupiter is kind of reassuring, because again, it gives him this sort of inflexible confidence in what he says. Like, no matter what, I'm not apologizing. It's this way. It's like that. We need to build the wall. That's it. It's going to happen. I'm totally certain. I'm going to be determined. At least I'm going to say it, no matter how unreasonable it might be, whether you think it's possible or not. That's the way it is. There's a real benefit to that on some level. Some people that want a simple, clear, confident, unshakable answer likes that. To other people who are maybe looking for more nuance, they start saying, well, how are you going to do that? You got to get it through Congress. You got to get people to agree to it. How are you going to get Mexico to pay for it? They're another country. They're not a company you can order around. How do you keep all the Muslims out? We have agreements with all these countries. You have to get that through Congress. You have to do all kinds of things. Things are more complicated than just this simple. But again, that Saturn influence on Jupiter tends to make it like very, I'm going to control it this way. Like that sort of energy of Saturn on the big picture of Jupiter. And because it's influencing his second house, it really affects the speech. And again, it's something that's a kind of process. It goes over well sometimes. It doesn't go over well other times. It's, sometimes it's, it's quite useful in certain areas to like stay on track, to handle the financial situation and to handle this sort of thing. In other ways, it's not so much. It's kind of like a sort of dynamic thing that is also sort of back and forth and sort of contradicting at times. It's not so solid. It's a process that he's sort of working through. And when you get the one-way aspect especially, the one-way aspect is something where the one that's receiving it is either receiving the good or the bad thing. To use those gross terms. For instance, the Sun is receiving the graceful aspect of Jupiter in his chart. It's receiving the blessing of Jupiter. Jupiter gives the one-way blessing. The Sun doesn't give it back, so the Sun doesn't return its integrity to Jupiter. You see? So this is the thing about his Jupiter as well. His Jupiter is giving a blessing to the Sun, which confers, leadership and, it sort of inspires. It can be inspiring to others. But then his Jupiter is getting a one-way aspect from Saturn, which is like sort of controlling it through fear. This is what Saturn does. It doesn't necessarily control it negatively, but it definitely can, especially because his Jupiter is in Virgo and it's retrograde. Oftentimes a Saturn aspect on to Jupiter really brings a real practical hand into Jupiter's kind of airy-fairy ideas. It kind of does that with him too, but it's more on a dark end because of the dignity of Jupiter in Virgo, where it's not so wise, at least by nature, and that Jupiter's retrograde, so it's already kind of, going back and forth with itself. And then also that Mars, Rashi aspect onto the Moon, which already is also quite stressed. Moon is in Scorpio with Ketu, and it's the one-way aspect from Mars. So again, Mars is not receiving the blessing of the Moon in return, because it's not a mutual aspect, just like Saturn is not receiving the blessing of Jupiter in return with Saturn's aspect. It's not a dialogue. It's a one-way aspect. So ponder this difference between those fixed qualities of the person as seen through the Rashi aspects and these processes, these dynamic things that sort of change and come in and out and are much more kind of fluid and even, I would say, even sort of more psychological. What I would say about the planetary aspects is they're much more about this psychological evolving process, and the Rashi aspects are much more about these fixed, again, these just fixed parts of who we are. That's the way I am, and that's it. Whereas with the planetary aspects, it's kind of a flow. It looks this way sometimes it doesn't. It looks this way to some people, to other people it doesn't. There's no way to misconstrue like those Rashi aspect qualities. This is the way it is by looking at the person's life, like I've already described. With the planetary aspects, these are processes. These are things where, again, some people like it, some people don't. Sometimes it's this way, sometimes it's that way. And you get this whole kind of range of the way the planets work and which one is getting more of the, difficult part of the aspect, or whether it's a sharing, or whether it's like a blessing from Jupiter, or a kind of intensity from Mars, intensity from Saturn, or whether they're shared back and forth like his Sun and Moon do. Quite interesting. And in the next video, I'll talk about some other important qualities of the aspects. And if you're interested in actually learning more, you should register for the course that I'm starting in early January 2016. You'll really like it. I'm going to go much deeper into all of these things, to each one of the planets, have a lot of case studies. So you see this over and over again instead of just hearing me, describe it once.